4 years. 4 fucking years since the start of Gamergate. It can't be. It can't be 4. Alright, Jean-Luc, chill out. Okay, I guess it is 4. Well, it was 4 on the 27th. That's what... Well, you can quibble over when Gamergate actually started, but the first big proper use of the tag, the hashtag, which would come to define the movement, came from Adam Baldwin on the 27th.
You might not believe it, but under fire, Animal Mother's one of the finest human beings in the world.
On the minuscule off chance that you're not familiar with Gamergate, here's what it was. For a long time there had been a great deal of tension building in many geek and nerd communities, but most especially gaming, which is the biggest, most profitable, most noticeable geek community that there is. There had been problems with all kinds of things, from people being paid for reviews, to advertising not being disclosed, to basic journalistic standards not being adhered to in a $100 billion industry. People preaching from on high about how bad and horrible the gaming community supposedly was, and all of this was bubbling away beneath the surface. It took one thing, one spark to set all that off, and that was a rather poor indie game that's barely a game. It's okay as an explanation of depression, of helping people understand that, but not really a game. That got loads of praise, and it then emerged later on that the creator of the game had been sleeping with a games journalist who had given them positive coverage. This was like the last straw. It was something people were laughing at to start with, but then as the corruption emerged, that's when people got angry. And it was coming from the indie gaming community, who had always been rather right on, and who had been looking down on everyone else. So they were revealed to have feet of clay. So that brought the anger to a rolling boil, and then the games media, which in the past had always defended gaming as a hobby against the slings and arrows flung at it by its enemies, they turned on the gaming audience. They stood in judgment over of them. They defended the people who had been corrupt or not disclosed their personal relationships, and we were away and running. Now the odds are that's not the version you've been told, or perhaps even the version that you've experienced.
Never tell me the odds.
The version you've probably heard is that cis-het white old male nerds resent somehow that their space is becoming more progressive and inclusive, and that they're trying to keep women out of the hobby, or racial minorities out of the hobby, or sexual minorities out of the hobby, or whatever else. And you'll have heard this about games, science fiction novels, tabletop games, you name it, comics, really. Yeah, all of these things seem to be running into this same issue, and I really don't think that's it, because nerd spaces have always been inclusive. They've been the places for the weirdos and the freaks and the nerds to hang out. You know, the sexual minorities, plenty of gamers of various stripes have been gay or whatever. Gaming has provided a safe space, ironically, and an outlet for all kinds of people that just didn't fit in. So I think it's the opposite problem. It's that nerds are now popular.
Bazinga. Bazinga. Bazinga.
When something gets popular, the fakes, the shills, the exploiters all start to turn up. Lots of people start to turn up into something that was yours, that was special, that you had a massive emotional resonance with. And in nerd spaces there is also a very long tradition of being attacked by outsiders. D&D is satanic. Comics turn you into a juvenile delinquent. Heavy metal makes you commit suicide. Games turn you into a murderer. And this just goes in cycles. And I think you can understand, even if you disagree, why some of the arguments that swirled around Gamergate, because it wasn't just about corruption, it was also about censorship and criticism. But if you look at the history, if you look at the context, I think whether you agree or not, you can understand why games are misogynistic. Seems very similar to games turn you into a murderer, games make you violent, all the rest of it. It has the character of another moral panic, whether you agree or not. It's the same arguments with just slightly different rhetoric. You know, instead of murder simulators, it's telling you that they objectify women or whatever else. So this did get caught up in feminist critique and so on as well, because that had been turned upon games in the same way that Jack Thompson in the past had attacked games for supposedly contributing to violence, when the correlations are actually the opposite. So I think in good faith you can understand where people are coming from. Their hobby was under attack. It suddenly had this big influx of people who weren't part of the tribe. They were very defensive. Corruption had been going on. They had been being attacked by their own press, and eventually, communally, they just fucking snapped. Now, since then, we've seen Gamergate get blamed for, well, everything from Donald Trump to Brexit to God knows what else. People love to game drop Gamergate, usually in connection with the alt-right or something like that, which is very odd because survey after survey showed that Gamergate as a group, as a collective, trended very much left libertarian, the bottom left quadrant of the political compass, if you will. So the idea that this movement could somehow be right-wing doesn't really make any sense. There's some ways in which it makes some sort of sense, in that some of the people that moved in to try and exploit all this energy that was going on in Gamergate were the right wing. The right wing news outlets and websites were pretty much the only ones, with the exception of HuffPost Live maybe, that gave Gamergate a fair shake, that allowed them to present their case and make their arguments and actually discuss those arguments. Games media, which trends left authoritarian, did not. They were almost unified in their condemnation of Gamergate as a misogynistic hate group. And this is still the dominant narrative years later, after which local law enforcement says that's not the case. The FBI investigated, not the case. Surveys such as Women Action Media Survey demonstrated that Gamergate was not any more abusive than the general background noise of Twitter, which admittedly isn't saying very much, but there you go. And a study we recently just became aware of that was into online harassment, and about a large section of that is about Gamergate, yet the analysis demonstrates that the main communication nodes of Gamergate were women. You know, and this was odd for a misogynistic hate movement. The mascot's a girl. It's that the narrative is at odds with the reality, and people go to extraordinary lengths to try and claim otherwise. And they continue to make the same mistakes. When it comes to Comicsgate, which is the one that's bigger and rumbling on at the moment, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're presenting it as something it is not, or even if it is that thing, it's not the arguments that it is publicly making. In Comicsgate, people are publicly making the argument that they do not like their comics being turned into propaganda tools. And they don't like tokenism. And the comics have always been inclusive, have always had minority characters and so on, all of which is true. Yeah, if you tackled people's actual arguments rather than trying to claim that they're bigots and misogynists and whatever else, then you could get some progress, some mutual understanding. I think both sides could agree that tokenism is bad and wrong, that giving someone a job just because they tick the minority boxes isn't a good thing, it's patronising. You know, I think both sides could agree on that. But if you actually tackled the arguments that they're making, who would really be left outside of those honest actors who are engaged in debate? That would out the actual bigots, and there might be room for mutual understanding, and even two parallel threads, and that goes for games, which is still ongoing. We're now seeing another push to blame games for all the world's social ills after the shooting at the Madden tournament, which is barely a computer game anyway, it's sports. So yeah, this whole thing just keeps rumbling on and coming back to the surface, and people keep making the same mistakes, conflating trolls with honest actors just in order to dismiss their arguments, accusing people rather than dealing with the things that they're trying to say. And this is continuing and starting to have a broader impact. So when people do invoke Gamergate when it comes to politics and society, they kind of have a point, but not in the way that they think. Because the other big thing is the internet and free expression thereon.
I kept dreaming of a world I thought I'd never see. And then, one day...
You got in.
That's right, man. I got in.
It used to be that the internet was the Wild West. It was the complete, unfiltered id of everyone who was hooked up to it. It also had certain standards for who could hook up to it. It took a certain amount of technical expertise, a willingness to absorb the cost when phone lines used to be per minute and you didn't have a separate dedicated line for your internet. You know, things used to be different, better in some ways, worse in others. But as more and more people piled onto the internet, as the internet got normalized, and as the sheer flow of information scaled beyond our capability to really conceive of it, it became necessary for that to be searchable, for it to be moderated to an extent, for there to be safety for minors and certain others. And so the Wild West got settled. The Pinkertons showed up, the bank opened, the telegraph office opened up, and suddenly there were bylaws and things that you couldn't carry your pistols, there were fighting words, you know, things like that. You couldn't jump people's claims and get away with it, so to speak, to push a metaphor far, far too far. So we've tended to congregate around things that allow us to delve into this huge swathe of information in a way that's actually usable. The path of least resistance has led us to search engines, Google in particular. I don't think anyone can argue that they completely dominate web search at this point. And we have also congregated on social media. There were several abortive previous attempts, but now socially you've really got Facebook, you've got YouTube, you've got Twitter, and the various other things that they also control, such as Instagram. And lest we forget, YouTube is under Google. So all of this information, this access to this information, the way in which it is presented and turned up to us, is controlled by less than a handful of companies. So if they have any bias, if they choose to enforce bylaws of their own, you know, corporate standards, terms of service or whatever, these have massive, far-reaching effects on everybody. The public square, the place where we have the conversations about politics and about society and about everything else, are now very firmly in private hands, where our hard-fought, hard-won rights, such as the right to free expression, are not upheld, because these are private companies and they have access to the same rights. And that means wherever you lie on the political spectrum, it should concern you that this handful of Silicon Valley executives, you know, existing within a small high-tech bubble of a practically homogenous political viewpoint, control the discourse utterly and completely. You can go to a different site. not with anything like as much traffic, not with anything like as much exposure. You know, it's like comparing the BBC to some guy ranting from a soapbox. The internet was the great leveler. Anyone could get their message out there. This was part of the problem, but it was also part of the glory of the internet. And early on, you had to learn to analyze this information yourself. So where this wraps back around to Gamergate and related movements is that alleged harassment and misogyny and insults and so on are being used as excuses to push censorship, to press down the discourse, to get rid of certain people. Now, Alex Jones is an execrable piece of shit, but he should still have the right to free expression. He should still be allowed on these platforms. And he's just an extreme. Yeah, hate laws are being misapplied so that if someone teaches their pug the Roman salute, or to respond with excitement to certain phrases that would get this video demonetized if it hasn't been already, yeah, these problems should concern everyone, and yet a certain stripe of person, the mainstream media, personalities, celebrities, journalists, all seem to be happily clapping and cheering on censorship. This is peculiar to me, especially for people who seem to consider themselves to be on the left. Why would you cheer on such a regressive, non-progressive thing as censorship? And it turns out, as Orwell noted in Road to Wigan Pier, the middle-class champagne socialist types just don't like mingling with the hoi polloi. They don't like being told that they're wrong or being called a faggot. You can't exactly blame them for all of that, but they're enabling this structure of censorship. We've got governments doing end runs around rights legislation, such as Germany, applying pressure to companies to censor for them, because that way it's not the government censoring, it's the company. Yeah, these are huge problems, and fake news is another problem. How do we determine what's accurate, what's good information or not? Especially when we discover that we can't trust these curators of content, the Googles and the Facebooks and whoever else, that they are grabbing our data and just selling it to the highest bidder. That's causing problems, or censoring certain points of view or certain modes of expression. You know, these are all huge problems. And one thing Gamergate did do was that it turned people on to just how shit the media has become, how lazy, how they don't bother to look into things or even talk to people who are the subjects of the stories. And we didn't just turn the page and assume that they knew what they were talking about when it came to the next topic. Gamergate didn't create Donald Trump. It's not alt-right. It never was. There's a handful of right-wing people in it. It didn't create Brexit. It didn't create the crisis that we're having online in the clash between free speech and safety and all the rest of it. You know, these are deep cultural problems that were merely exposed by this and the ongoing culture wars across nerd media. Now, Liana Kersner, who is someone I have a great deal of time for and who I think provides a useful version of feminist critique rather than moral panic, she thinks that these culture wars don't do anything useful. Well, while on paper and in too much of the historical record, Gamergate will be seen as only a bad thing, it has encouraged people to keep an eye on their media. It has inspired similar resistance movements in other media, and you may think that's bad or good, but I think we're seeing a lot of creativity come out of that. One thing I was always impressed with in Gamergate was the sheer level of creativity and enthusiasm that was present in that community, even as they were being blasted from all sides. In Comicsgate, we see people going out and making new comics very successfully, you know, competing equally or even surpassing the establishment. That can only be a good thing. This is genuine diversity, people making new and different things. So I don't think it has been entirely negative, and we have seen news outlets and so on enforce their ethics rules more firmly. We've seen the FCC crack down on native advertising and things. These are all results of Gamergate. And suspicion and cynicism and skepticism towards the media can only be healthy, provided people don't just wander off and get suckered into conspiracy media or get tempted away to the opposite extreme. But overall, I think it's kind of hopeful. Overall, it's just the problem is people continue to lie, people continue to make exactly the same mistakes, and they continue to smear people who oppose them on understandable, comprehensible ideas as bigots and extremists, when it's just not true. If there's one piece of advice I would have for anybody finding themselves on the opposite side of another Gamergate or another Comicsgate or anything, it would be this. Address their actual arguments. Discuss with them honestly and openly. It doesn't mean you have to agree. It doesn't even mean you have to give ground. But attack their arguments and their points and their ideas. Don't construct these straw men, these straw misogynists and bigots and racists and whatever to attack. Address what they're actually saying, and you never know, you might find some common ground and make some progress. Or even learn to tolerate one another. Zang.
I'm a ninja. Yo, my life is like a video game. My main thing when I'm in the zone. One player, one life in the mark. Remember the dog.
Go ninja, go!
No fucking it down. I'm cutting down anyone I'm apart. Trying to fuck up my game with razor sharp political throw stars. Shit, my flow's on horse.
What happened today? See, I don't like the. I have, okay, like a lot of you, I hate a lot. You know? But I hate with style and creativity.